in the Panhandle of Texas, nestled in a wide meadow that sat beneath the bluffs overlooking the Canadian River, 28 men and 1 woman were nervous. Doors stood open to invite the breezes of the plains to blow into the 4 main buildings of the Adobe Wals Buffalo trading community. The men played cards, packed supplies for their morning buffalo hunt, and discussed the recent murders of their own kind committed by the angry Indians nearby. There'd been plenty of small but heinous Indian attacks on buffalo hunters camped up and down the creeks coming off the Canadian River, but surely they wouldn't attack the Wals, even though this was the base of the only civilized souls for 150 miles. Still, the men have work to do, and none is more anxious to get to it than the famed frontiersman, Billy Dixon. Why, just this evening, he'd made a partnership with James Hanrahan, owner of the saloon at Adobe Wals, and a very fine buffalo hunter himself. Hanrahan was having trouble getting a man who could hunt fast enough to keep his 7 buffalo skinners busy.
I told him that nothing would please me more than to go into partnership with him, and that I could easily kill enough buffalo to keep 20 skinners hard at work every day. Hanrahan offered to give me half of all profits, which was as liberal as any man could wish for.
Dixon rolls his new Sharps 44 Buffalo rifle, the next best thing to the big 50 he lost a few days before, into a blanket to protect it from the morning's moisture. He decides to sleep under the stars, next to his recently repaired wagon that sits outside Tom O'Keefe's blacksmith shop.
I'm gonna say it's 2 o'clock in the morning or thereabouts, and loud crack reverberated all over town. Everybody heard it.
Oscar Shepard, the bartender who ran the saloon for James Hanrahan, calls out, "Everyone clear out. The ridgepole is cracking." There was a crack heard that everyone said sounded like a gunshot. Those men nearest the saloon sleeping in the Rath and Wright store get up.
Somebody went out to the wood pile to grab a pole to jam underneath the ridgepole so it wouldn't fall if it was cracked. They say there was a pole that was cut to the exact size just sitting out there waiting, which was kind of strange.
By this time, everyone is up, so Hanrahan offers everyone free drinks.
And Billy Dixon was going to head out with his team of skinners that morning anyway. So he decided, well, I might as well get an early start. By about 4 a.m., the first streaks of light were starting to show from the sunrise.
Most of the horses were grazing in the meadow by the river east of the Wals. So Dixon tells Billy Ogg to bring them in.
And looked out towards where Billy was walking out to get the horses, and see something out there, just barely through the dark. Looked again, and that's when it was bone chilling. They was all yelling one big war whoop, and they was a whipping and spurring and courting their horses, and they was coming fast, not to cut off the horses, but right straight at the buildings. They was coming for us. One solid war whoop that shook the very air, and they was coming like lightning. Their bronze bodies barely hanging on those horses. It was all bedecked in silver and feathers and had scalps hanging on their vitals. It was quite a sight. The flower of the plains, the fighting men, all painted up in their ochre and their war paint and the horses. It was a sight to see that you never care to see again.
From the valley, by the trees near the water, the dark shadow of hundreds of men, caught in the black hole of time, fly into the future, compelled by their hearts that hold on to the freedom of their past, putting blind hope in a bitter man who sits on a horse atop a distant hill and watches. Completely exposed, Dixon wildly fires a shot and turns, and with Billy Ogg at his heels, runs to the closest building, the saloon. Banging on the door, which has now been locked, bullets and spears fly past the two men.
Dixon estimated that there were about 600. Others have gone all the way up to 1,000. Not 600, 700. He's comfortable with that number. And again, that's a magnificent sight. But that's not the only place that they were. They went to the south and opened fire. They went to the north and opened fire. There's another hill to the north, a mesa. They went to the west and opened fire. They were continually running back and forth.
The impressive swarm of magnificent warriors covered in yellow ochre astride yellow-painted ponies split their force at the saloon, some continuing to circle the prairie compound. Others dismount to climb on roofs, hoping to hack through the sod. Some Indians tried to breach windows and doors using weapons, boards, or barrels. It is reported that even Quanah Parker tried to get his horse to kick through the door of one of the buildings, but the structures held.
Most of the best hunters were in the Myers and Leonard compound, which was probably the least defensible area. They had a big stockade fence around it that was used as a hide yard, to store hides in there. So it was just a big fence, but all the men were concentrated in the one building in the upper northeast corner of it. So the Indians pretty much had free reign to go around the entire stockade and use the stockade itself as cover. And so systematically then they killed any horses that were inside the stockade. They had stables in there too. That was one of the goals of the Indians, were to kill every horse that the buffalo hunters had, to strand them out here. So there were lots of oxen around there that had recently brought down supplies, teams of oxen, I think upwards of 20 or so oxen, especially one team of brothers, the Scheidler brothers, Ike and Shorty Scheidler. They were actually parked just outside the Myers and Leonard stockade and were sleeping in their wagon, and were going to leave the next morning, or that morning. And out in the open, of course, they were one of the first to be killed there. There were reports that the Indians didn't see them in there right away and maybe lifted up the wagon cover and got a blast in the face, shot by one of the Scheidlers. Well, it didn't take long to finish them off, and in short time they scalped the Scheidler brothers, both of them, Ike and Shorty. They had a dog with them too, a big Newfoundland dog, one of those big black Newfoundland dogs, and I guess the dog put up a pretty good defense for the Scheidlers also, and the Indians viewed that as a heroic deed by the dog, so they even cut out a strip of hide from the dog's side as a scalp too. So in the morning, their first victory of the Scheidler brothers, they waved the scalps, to the buffalo hunters and show off that they had killed some of them and they're coming for more.
Inside the buildings, many of the men were still in bare feet and long underwear. Sacks and crates of supplies had been quickly stacked against windows and doors. The first group to fire back at the Indians were those in the saloon, which included Ogg, Dixon, Bat Masterson, and the bartender Oscar Shepard. It's recorded that as the men hurried to defend their stations, Shepard cried out in festive dance hall fashion, "Men to the right, ladies to the left," perhaps as good a reflection as any of the adventuresome spirit of the times. Immediately to the south of the saloon stood Rath and Wright's store and small corral. The store was well stocked with weapons and ammunition for future trades and sales. However, there were only a handful of hunters inside, along with the blacksmith Tom O'Keefe, the store manager James Langton, and cooks William Olds and his wife Hannah. And Hannah was a problem. If her whereabouts was discovered by the Indians, their vehemence would only escalate, considering her scalp the crown of their victory. For the first half hour, the Indians were reckless, but when the buffalo hunters finally got straightened out, they were firing with deadly effect. According to Billy Dixon,
they gradually began to fall back as we were emptying rawhide saddles entirely too fast for Indian safety.
I'm always impressed by the courage of the Indians. And of course they grew up in a tradition like this, but you've got rifles, obviously, that can shoot a mile, you know, and they probably knew this, and yet they charged them anyway.
it may be that the Indians' courage came from their belief in what they call scalp lock. That is, if a warrior should lose his scalp lock, his spirit would fail to reach the happy hunting grounds, which may also be the reason the Indian always tried to scalp his fallen enemy. When their wounded or dead lay dangerously close to the buildings, the Indian braves would rush in on horses or afoot to rescue them. Once during a charge, Dixon noticed an Indian riding a white horse toward some tall grass where he had seen another Indian fall. The latter Indian jumped up behind the Indian on the horse, and both started at full speed for safety. A rifle cracked, and a bullet struck the horse. With blood streaming down the beast's leg, both Indians began whipping the poor brute as he lurched and staggered on three legs to move his riders out of harm's way. Time and again, with the fury of a whirlwind, the Indians charged upon the buildings, only to sustain greater losses than they were able to inflict.
I'm sure that we surprised the Indians as badly as they surprised us. They expected to find us asleep, unprepared for an attack. Their medicine man had told them that all they would have to do would be to come to Adobe Wals and knock us on the head with sticks, and that our bullets would not be strong enough to break an Indian's skin. The old man was a poor prophet.
I think just reading things of Indians that heard the story, they doubted him to begin with. He was all painted up, and he said, "You don't have to worry about those bullets. You know, I'm the medicine man, and I'm telling you that the bullets will not penetrate your body." And the thing is, Quanah Parker believed him 100%, and people believed Quanah Parker.
Ironically, Quanah Parker, the last chief of the Comanche, and a warrior that all tribes respected, was one of the first Indians to be injured.
Very early in the battle, Quanah Parker was hit, they think by a ricochet shot somewhere between his neck and shoulder blade in the back. You know, fell off his horse and I guess came up behind the carcass of a buffalo and spent some time there until he was able to crawl to a plum thicket where some of his friends took him. But he was basically out of the battle. Yeah, it demoralized them pretty quick, and they pulled back. And of course, you know, they were in the middle of this battle. They weren't going to just stop. You know, they had the opportunity to kill these men, but they decided we need a better strategy.
When the Indians began to pull back, the hunters had time to process what they'd just lived through. Dixon recalled that he became aware of a pony standing near the corner of a large stack of buffalo hides at the rear of the Rath's building. Straining his neck, he could barely make out an Indian behind the hides, holding the bridle of the painted pony. Dixon shot the colt, which immediately fell dead, exposing the Indian, and the hunters in Hanrahan's saloon quickly opened fire on the warrior.
No Indian ever danced a livelier jig. We kept him jumping like a flea, back and forth behind the pile of hides.
By noon, the Indians had ceased charging and positioned themselves in all directions of the walls, maintaining regular fire. Earlier, the crack-shot Dixon had swapped his Sharps 40 for Hanrahan's Big 50 that was being ineffectively used by the bartender James Shepard. With a lull in the battle, Dixon and Hanrahan decided to make a run for Rath and Wright's next door to restock their ammunition, since Rath's had over 1,000 rounds of ammo brought down earlier from Dodge City. Until this time, the occupants of each building were unaware of any situation other than their own. Amazingly, no one in the saloon or in Rath and Wright's was hit or hurt, but the two men were stunned at how many horses lay dead all around. However, anxiety was high in the Rath store due to their occupant, Mrs. Olds.
If the Indians would have known of her presence, there's no telling what they might attempt. And a determined attack by the Indians would have meant death for everyone and everybody in the store, for none would have suffered themselves to be taken alive, or permitted Mrs. Olds to be captured.
Begging the marksman to stay, Hanrahan returned alone to the saloon with a sack full of ammunition in hand.
Billy's with the Rath and Company store, helping defend them against the Indians. First thing he does is he goes to the back door and climbs up on this large pile of sacks of flour and grain and all sorts of stuff that they barricade the doors with. You know, that's what they did in all the buildings, was they barricaded with whatever they had in the stores up against the doors. So there was an open transom above it. They hadn't filled it with anything, and there was no window or anything, so Billy could see out into the grass towards the west. He noticed some feathers in the grass. An Indian was crawling towards the building, so he took aim with this borrowed 50 caliber Sharps that he had borrowed from the bartender. He fired and missed. So he fired again and he hit. And I think after a total of 3 shots, the Indian finally stopped crawling. And he checked it out later after the battle, and there was the Indian with a shot in the knee. And you could tell that he had dragged himself for several yards before dying.
Almost from the beginning of the battle, the hunters had been surprised by the sound of a bugle coming from the Indians, trumpeting different calls which the braves followed with military precision. The warrior blowing the horn never came close enough to the buildings for the hunters to recognize. Bad Masterson recalled,
"Every bugle call he blew was carried out to the letter by the Indians, showing that the bugler had the Indians thoroughly drilled."
The bugler was killed later that afternoon as he was running from the Shadler brothers' wagon. Harry Armitage in the Myers and Leonard store shot the bugler in the back as he was running away, holding his bugle and a tin can filled with sugar with one arm, and another can filled with ground coffee in the other. If the bugling wasn't annoying enough, the hunters also had to deal with the constant raspy and excited cry of young crow that they had captured shortly after their arrival at Adobe Wals. Making it a pet, the crow stuck around during even the worst of the battle, flying from one building to another, in and out of open windows. Chased out of one structure by the hunters, it would fly to another. And despite all the bullets, arrows, and lances, the bird was never injured.
Guys there at Buffalo at the Adobe Wals was all pretty good shots. And we didn't waste a lot of shells. Matter of fact, that's how it was in the business. They figured that you wasn't making money if you was having to shoot buffalo more than once. So everybody was making their first shot count. There was guys in that first 30 minutes, it was scary. The boys over at the Myers and Leonard store, they had just them little picket walls that started with mud daubing in between them. Them guys had run up and was trying to, they had a window over there, and you'd see hands come in with 6-shooters, and they just shoot into the building from each side, just alternating like that. And so, those guys was outside those buildings, just backed up to them, and said you could see through that daubing that was getting shot out between those sticks. Those guys pressing up against the buildings, you could see the bronze little suntanned hides shining through and pooching through between those sticks. And you knew it was Indians. It was right there, just through that little stick wall.
Though most of the Indian warriors wounded or killed near the buildings were dragged off by their comrades, there were some exceptions.
One Indian had crept up close to the store and I guess fired a pistol through some of the chinking, but he was taken out and shot pretty quickly, but paralyzed, I guess. I guess he was hit in the back and was still alive. And he was calling out to his father that was further out. The father was giving him instructions, I guess. So they could hear him talking, and probably singing his death song, I'm sure. And one of the hunters leaned out to point his gun at this Indian. At the sight of this, the Indian took his pistol and shot himself.
Around 4 that afternoon, the Indians had moved further from the buildings, and the battle started easing up. Several men spotted Indian trinkets laying on the ground, so they eased outside, grabbed them, and weren't shot.
The thing that really affected people the most was the horses. They had adopted the tactics of putting us afoot out there, so they had deliberately tried to not run or stalk off so much as just kill it. It's what killed Billy Tyler, we think. Billy Tyler had went out to help one of the horses, and they just out there in that picket stockade, they was just setting ducks. So it's too hot for them, so they tried to get back inside the building, and he made it. He got inside the door, he turned to fire one last shot, and they got him through the lungs. He bled out in about 30 minutes.
By sundown that first day of battle, 3 hunters were dead. An unknown number of Indians were dead, and some of those warriors, along with countless dead horses, lay near the buildings at Adobe Wals. Everyone tried to rest.
Hot and still and muggy, and one of the more miserable nights you'll ever see. It was eerie. Yeah, the guys had backed off, but there had been enough people with enough Indian experience to know that, yeah, they could do it, but they probably won't bother us tonight. So it was a pretty fitful sleep that everybody had, just replaying scenes of it in their mind all night long. And next morning was eerie.
They get through that first day, all right, and they get up and nothing's happening. The big problem that you've got now is stench. You've got all of these dead animals and human beings laying out there, including a few of their own, and they've got to do something with them.
That next morning, that crow was going from horse carcass to horse carcass and just squalling. Of course, we had buffalo hides all over. We'd take a hide or something and maybe a couple of them and tie them together with a rope, roll them dead, bloated horses over on them and drag them all together in one spot. Ended up digging a pit and trying to bury them as best we could.
Those that weren't burying the dead were busy repairing and fortifying the walls. The hunters built bastions on top of the buildings by cutting a trap door from inside the structure onto the roof. Using crude ladders, a lookout could see across the valley within a low, protected enclosure. Later that afternoon, 2 teams belonging to a German Civil War veteran named George Belfield were spotted coming up the valley of the Canadian River. Earlier, Andy Johnson had picked up a few blankets from the battlefield and made them into a flag that he hoisted above the walls as a morale booster for the men. Seeing the flag and thinking it was a joke, Belfield, in broken English, told his men, Dem fellers think they's damn smart already. But when he drew nearer and saw the dead horses, he put the whip to his team and came in at a dead run. It was of the utmost importance that the folks at Adobe Wals get some help from Dodge City. Henry Lease, one of the hunters, agreed to run for help. Taking one of Bellfield's horses and belts full of ammunition, he shook hands with the others and rode off into the night. The Wals sent out 2 other men to warn hunters in the area that the Indians were on the warpath. On the 3rd day, about 15 Indians appeared on the edge of a bluff east of Adobe Wals. Known as a fine marksman, Dixon was challenged by some of the men to try his big .50 rifle on the warriors. Estimating the distance to be about 7/8 of a mile, Dixon took careful aim and pulled the trigger. The hunters saw an Indian fall from his horse as the other warriors ran for cover.
I was admittedly a good marksman, yet this is what might be called a scratch shot.
Kohea, an old Comanche veteran of the battle, later described the effect that Dixon's long shot had on the warriors.
One of our men was knocked off his horse by a spent bullet fired at a range of about a mile. It stunned but did not kill him. The buffalo hunters were too much for us. We lost the fight.
After the long shot, the Indians began to disperse. On the 5th day, William Olds was stationed in the lookout bastion atop Rath's store. Another lookout had shouted that Indians were coming, and all the men began to run for their guns. Hurrying down the ladder with rifle in hand, Olds' gun accidentally fired, blowing off the top of his head. His wife, Mrs. Olds, had just entered the room in time to see the body of her husband roll from the bottom of the ladder and crumple at her feet. With blood gushing from the dead man's head, Mrs. Olds, who by most accounts had held her composure until now, fell apart.
Her grief was intense and pitiable. A rough lot of men, such as we were, did not know how to comfort a woman in such distress. We did the best we could, and if we did it awkwardly, it should not be set down against us. Had we been called upon to fight for her, we would not have asked about the odds, but would have sailed in tooth and toenail. Billy Dixon.
Olds was buried that same evening, about 60 feet from the spot where he was killed, just southeast of Rath's store. Over the next several days, many more hunters from outlying areas came into the Wals, while others left. Hannah Olds was immediately sent to safety, and Billy Dixon returned to Dodge City.
Basically, the Indians kind of won at Adobe Wals. They sort of got what they were seeking. They stopped buffalo hunting, at least temporarily.
Around mid-July, only 20 men or so remained at Adobe Wals. It was about this time that the U.S. Army, under the direction of the commanding general of the United States Army, William T. Sherman, decided that enough was enough, and that there were too many settlers being killed by Indians. Several columns were instructed to come into the Texas Panhandle to take care of the Indian problem by pushing the hostiles onto their Oklahoma reservations. Nelson Miles of the 5th Infantry came by railroad from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, to Dodge City to organize these columns. Horses and Gatling guns, along with ammunition and supplies, gathered, coordinated, and shipped to the different forts. When Miles hires scouts, Billy Dixon is more than qualified and signs on. The chief of scouts, Army Lieutenant Baldwin, Billy Dixon and others soon leave Dodge City and head south, stopping by Adobe Wals to check things out. Those left at the Wals were glad and relieved to see the fresh faces, though they'd grown much more at ease since the Indian raid nearly a month earlier. And now, with the Army's presence, they felt fairly safe.
Billy Dixon took Frank Baldwin to the site of Adobe Wals, the modern site, or the 1874 site, and showed him around and talked about the battle and explained what happened and everything. Some of them either went hunting, or they also say they maybe went to go pick plums. Well, some Cheyennes came up and caught a couple hunters and started chasing them. One of them was on a wagon, another was on a horse, and the one on the wagon got away. The other one on the horse, he got lanced, and his name is George Huffman, and they scalped him right within view of the Army right there. Well, it took a little while for Frank Baldwin to get back to the cavalry camp. They organized the cavalry that were there. There was only about 20 or 25 men, and they chased the Indians back to the south, to the Canadian River. They crossed the river and in through the sandhills to the south, and they chased them for a while and basically lost them.
Sometimes referred to as the Third Battle of Adobe Wals. This last fatality at the Wals was one of the first deaths in what became known as the Red River War, which was officially engaged a month or so later at the Battle of Red River. In 1874, there were barely 314,000 Native American Indians in the contiguous United States, fighting millions of settlers moving west. A young country's need for expansion, new technology, and a bad medicine man all led to the Second Battle of Adobe Wals and the ensuing Red River War.
I mean, it's a tragic story no matter how you look at it, but we can't change it. It happened, and we can't look at it with today's view of how we consider things to be right or wrong. That's just how it was back then, and people were dealing with the realities of what it was back then. We need to remember it, not try to bury it or hide it. It's history, and it happened, so why not learn about it? And maybe it won't happen again.